The emergency alert shattered the silence of my bedroom at exactly 1:45 on a Tuesday, vibrating with such violent persistence against the wooden bedside table that I woke from a deep sleep assuming Danny was calling with an actual crisis. Blinking against the sudden blue glare, I found a jarring public safety notice dominating the upper half of my screen, warning residents who were experiencing numbness, involuntary movements, or unusual repetitive behaviors to remain indoors, while explicitly advising against restraining any affected limbs. Thinking it was an elaborate digital prank or an accidental transmission from a psychiatric facility, I immediately took a screenshot and sent it to my family's group chat, waiting only seconds before my father texted back to dismiss it as a system hack that would inevitably prompt an official apology by dawn. Even though I could hear the muted hum of the television broadcasting from the downstairs living room, a restless curiosity drove me out of bed and down the carpeted stairs to find my father standing near the kitchen island with his phone illuminated in his hand, while my mother sat tucked beneath her favorite knitted blanket at the far end of the sofa. When I questioned why an official alert would specifically instruct people not to restrain their own limbs, my father simply chuckled and suggested that our arms were preparing to stage a rebellion, prompting my mother to laugh warmly and reach across the coffee table for a packet of chocolate biscuits, joking that hers had already defected. We shared a few more easy laughs about the absurdity of the message, taking comfort in the fact that the late-night news broadcasts continued with their regular programming, and the surrounding neighborhood remained completely devoid of sirens or flashing emergency lights. By 12:30, the unsettling language of the notification had entirely faded from my mind, and I climbed back into bed, drifting off into a deep dreamless sleep that lasted until the bright mid-morning sun filtered through my blinds. When I finally reached for my phone, I was instantly alarmed to find 3 missed calls from Danny, and more than 20 unread messages frantically asking if I was watching the news. Rather than reading through the backlog of texts, I hurried out of my room because I could hear the television downstairs blaring at an unusually high volume, vibrating through the floorboards with a steady, droning urgency that felt immediately wrong. As I reached the bottom step, I saw both of my parents sitting close together on the sofa, their posture rigid and silent as they stared intently at a live broadcast showing a field reporter standing outside our city's primary hospital, which was completely swarmed by a chaotic gridlock of ambulances. The reporter, speaking with a strained voice that betrayed her professionalism, explained that hundreds of citizens had been rushed to emergency rooms overnight after experiencing sudden muscle spasms, localized numbness, and a terrifying loss of voluntary motor control that typically originated in a single hand or forearm before spreading to the rest of the body. Beside her, live footage played on a loop showing a middle-aged man in a robe being guided toward the open doors of an ambulance by 2 protective paramedics. He appeared frightened but entirely lucid until his right arm suddenly shot backward with unnerving speed, his fingers clamping like a vice around one of the paramedics' clear plastic face shields. As the worker struggled to pry the man's fingers away, the patient began weeping and apologizing frantically, crying out repeatedly that he was not controlling his arm and that he didn't mean to attack them, before the camera abruptly cut back to the studio anchor. The anchor went on to clarify that patients remained fully conscious and aware during these episodes, though advanced stages of the condition could severely interfere with balance, vocal cords, and general mobility, prompting the government to dispatch specialized medical quarantine teams to heavily affected neighborhoods. Seeking comfort in shared disbelief, I muttered aloud that the alert clearly hadn't been a prank after all, but neither my mother nor my father turned their heads or acknowledged my presence in the room. As I stepped closer to the sofa, my eyes were drawn to my father's right hand resting atop his denim-clad knee. His fingers were slowly curling into a tight fist before extending fully flat, repeating the sequence in a mechanical, hypnotic rhythm that looked less like an anxious habit and more like an invisible technician testing the articulation of each joint. When I called out his name, the movement ceased with an unnatural abruptness, and he quickly tucked his hand between his knees, clearing his throat and blaming the motion on a temporary bout of pins and needles from sitting in one position too long. I turned my attention toward my mother and noticed that she was clutching her favorite ceramic mug in her left hand, using a metal teaspoon to endlessly stir the interior with a sharp rhythmic clinking sound, despite the fact that the cup was entirely dry and empty. When I pointed out that she had no tea in her mug, she paused, looked down into the dry ceramic basin with an expression of genuine bewilderment, and then immediately resumed the circular, scraping motion as though she had no power to stop her own wrist. A chill crawled up my spine as she managed to strain out through gritted teeth that she knew the cup was empty, her vocal cords sounding tight and restricted just as the news anchor warned all viewers to remain indoors and avoid unnecessary travel. An instant later, my mother opened her mouth and repeated the phrase, "Avoid unnecessary travel," matching the anchor's exact cadence and inflection, only at a much lower, hollow volume that lacked her natural warmth. My father turned his head sharply to look at her, and then with a synchronized precision that made me stumble backward against the staircase railing, both of my parents rotated their upper bodies to stare directly at me with wide, unblinking eyes. My father nervously tried to laugh off the eerie synchronicity, but the sound was thin and hollow, and I watched in mounting horror as his right hand slipped out from between his knees and began that hypnotic opening and closing routine once again. Feeling suddenly trapped in my own living room, I muttered an excuse about needing to reply to Danny's messages and quickly retreated up the stairs, locking my bedroom door securely behind me. Sitting at my desk, I finally opened the backlog of messages from Danny, which contained several video clips she had scraped from social media feeds before the platform algorithms could systematically scrub them for violating community guidelines. The first file showed a young woman sitting on her linoleum kitchen floor, her left arm repeatedly stretching upward to unlock her front door while her right hand gripped the rebellious wrist, dragging it back toward her chest in a grueling physical tug-of-war while the person filming begged her not to restrain the limb. The second video had already been removed by the time I tapped the thumbnail, but the third clip showed an older man weeping over a laptop while his non-dominant hand danced across the keyboard with blurring speed, typing out the phrase "let them iron" over and over again without his eyes ever dropping to the screen. Danny's accompanying text messages were frantic, explaining that her older brother had locked himself in the bathroom after his arm tried to throw their car keys out the window, and when I tried to call her directly, the line clicked immediately to an automated network busy signal. I switched over to my laptop browser and loaded the official government health advisory site, which described the outbreak as a temporary neuromuscular condition of unknown origin that presented without fever or traditional contagion markers. The advisory explicitly emphasized that while affected individuals might experience brief intervals where their limbs operated independently, total loss of consciousness was rare, and there was currently no scientific evidence supporting person-to-person transmission. The grassroots social media discussions painting a much darker picture, however, with independent medical observers claiming that the duration of bodily hijacking grew exponentially longer as the contagion established itself within the central nervous system. One widely shared analysis, written by a neurology resident before his account was suspended, theorized that an unknown biological agent was systematically mapping human motor functions, using short bursts of control to test the circuitry before gradually suppressing the host's conscious override entirely. According to the consensus among the online threads, the initial motor interference almost always manifested in the victim's non-dominant hand, which caused my breath to catch in my throat as I looked down at my left arm resting innocuously on the desk beside my mouse pad. Being naturally right-handed, I stared at my pale left fingers and deliberately willed them to lift off the wooden surface, sending a clear, conscious command from my brain to my muscles, only to find that the limb remained entirely inert and unresponsive. There was no tingling numbness, no cold sensation, and no physical pain. My arm simply felt like an object that belonged to someone else, disconnected from my volition as completely as a piece of furniture in the room. Before I could process the rising panic of my own infection, my left hand suddenly animated on its own, sliding smoothly across the trackpad with practiced precision, guiding the digital pointer directly to the upper corner of the screen, and clicking the button to shut down my browser. I sat frozen, staring at my own knuckles in horror as the hand lingered over the trackpad for a few seconds before the unseen tension vanished, returning voluntary control to me so suddenly that I accidentally slammed my elbow against the desk rim. I spent the next several minutes flexing my fingers and rotating my wrist, desperately trying to convince myself that the episode had been a harmless muscle spasm brought on by poor posture and the psychological suggestion of the internet videos. When I reopened my laptop to check the local neighborhood forums, however, I discovered that during those brief seconds of overriding my will, my hand had also executed a precise keyboard shortcut to wipe my entire browser history and clear my system caches. As I sat struggling to understand the tactical logic behind deleting my web data, the heavy, rumbling sound of an engine idling drew me toward my bedroom window, where I parted the blinds to look out over the street. A large, unmarked white transport van had parked directly outside Mr. and Mrs. Ellis's house across the road, and 3 figures clad in full-body white protective suits and heavy, clear face shields were marching up the garden path. Mr. Ellis opened the front door looking deeply distraught, while his elderly wife stood a few paces behind him in the hallway, clutching her left arm tightly against her ribs with her right hand as though she were holding a wild animal. Even from my second-story vantage point, I could clearly see Mrs. Ellis's left hand violently twisting and wrenching itself away from her body, reaching out toward the approaching medical team with open, grasping fingers. When the protective workers reached the threshold and gently took her by the shoulders to guide her out, Mrs. Ellis began to weep with embarrassment, assuring her husband that she was still in control of her mind and that it was only a temporary nerve glitch. Her embarrassment instantly transformed into absolute terror when the workers swung open the heavy rear doors of the transport van, revealing a dimly lit interior lined with bench seats where several dozen neighborhood residents were secured with thick canvas restraints. One young man strapped near the back was thrashing his head against the metal wall, screaming at the top of his lungs that he was entirely rational and begging the workers to ask him complex mathematical equations to prove his mind was still his own. Upon seeing the interior of the vehicle, Mrs. Ellis's left arm suddenly shot outward, grabbing the sleeve of the nearest worker with immense physical strength, while the rest of her body violently recoiled in the opposite direction, her heels digging into the gravel driveway. She screamed over and over that she wasn't doing this, that her hand was betraying her, until one of the workers produced a small aerosol spray and directed a mist over her wrist, causing the limb to go limp enough for them to secure her inside the dark van. The heavy slam of the vehicle doors was echoed simultaneously by a sharp, authoritative knock on my own bedroom door, causing me to jump back from the window with my heart pounding against my ribs. My father's voice called out from the hallway, sounding deceptively calm and conversational as he asked me to open the door so we could discuss our household evacuation strategy before the medical teams reached our side of the street. I approached the wooden panel but kept the deadbolt turned, asking him if he was feeling okay, to which he immediately replied that he was completely fine, followed an instant later by my mother's voice echoing the exact same phrase with identical intonation from somewhere behind him. A heavy, unnatural silence hung over the corridor for a long moment before my father lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, suggesting that we needed to go downstairs together and report my mother to the health authorities because her symptoms were becoming impossible to hide. When I asked what was wrong with Mum, the response didn't come from my father. Instead, my mother repeated my question back to me. "What about Mum?" Her voice devoid of any emotional weight while the faint, maddening clinking of her teaspoon scraping against the ceramic mug resumed in the background. Seeing clearly that whatever was affecting them had progressed beyond mere muscle spasms into a shared echolalic loop, I accused them both of acting like puppets and refused to turn the lock. Without arguing or raising their voices, they simply turned away from the door, their footsteps descending the staircase in perfect, synchronized military unison that made the wooden steps groan beneath their combined weight. Returning to my desk, I found that my phone had automatically refreshed a social media feed to display a newly uploaded video, filmed covertly from inside one of the government transport vans as it bounced along a paved road. The camera was held by a terrified young woman whispering into her microphone over the sounds of weeping passengers, explaining that the medical teams were not taking anyone to standard hospital facilities or clinics. She claimed the workers were actively sorting the population into 2 distinct groups based on how thoroughly the neuromuscular condition had taken over their physical systems. Those who still actively fought the bodily hijacking were being sedated and taken to secure research labs, while those whose bodies showed seamless, unopposed control were being diverted elsewhere. The woman angled her camera toward a teenage boy sitting across the aisle from her, who looked entirely serene and relaxed, his hands resting quietly on his denim knees without any of the violent thrashing seen in the other passengers. According to the woman's whispered commentary, the boy's family had presented him to the quarantine workers as completely unaffected, but as the camera zoomed in on his face, the boy's left hand slowly lifted to his face and pressed a single finger to his lips in a universal gesture of silence, while his facial expression remained entirely vacant and unchanged.